A peculiar suit of armor. Pulling into the diner, I was aware of how weird coastal towns are. They hang on the edges of the map, almost like they exist in their own little world. This small East Coast town, named Weatherford, was no different. And like all coastal towns, there was never any sun, just a gray overcast with a slight drizzle. Not that it bothered me. I was a photographer, and places like Weatherford often made for great photo opportunities. The kind waitress took my order, and we made the same small talk I had made a million times on my drives throughout the country. Weatherford was like most small towns. The people were nice, but somewhat standoffish. There was a certain air about places like Weatherford, an air that seemed to say, "Enjoy your breakfast, but get lost afterwards." I planned on it. However, one part of Weatherford caught my eye as I was pulling through. At the end of the town was a church. I knew it would make a great photo the moment I saw it. When I asked the waitress about it, she tensed up. "That place has not been used in years, darling," she said, refilling my coffee and eyeing me. "Why do you want to know about a run-down church like that?" I reached into my bag and pulled out my DSLR camera. Anytime I held my camera, I felt like a gunslinger in an old western. It was my weapon, my pride and joy, my sword and shield, my everything. "Oh," the woman said, "a shutterbug. I should have known." "So it wouldn't be a problem if I went over and took some pictures?" "I suppose not," the woman said nervously. "But don't go poking around. It's closed up and you'd be trespassing if you stepped inside." "Wouldn't think of it," I said, grinning. "I'm serious," the woman said, not returning my smile. "Some things are better left off alone, because there are things in this world that will follow you, Mr. Shutterbug, no matter where you go." Pulling up to the church, I was made even more aware of how out of place it seemed in the small coastal town. It was like a building out of a 1920s German expressionist film. It was comprised of weird and harsh angles. Nothing about the church looked right. If the town of Weatherford was a mouth with perfectly average teeth, then the church was a lonely, sharp fang jutting out. And a fang is always looking to taste blood. I was also aware of a rotting smell, but I shoved it out of my mind. I pulled out my camera and started taking shots. I had a feeling this could be my best work yet. I didn't even have to do a lot of work. The subject itself was so overwhelming. No matter what shots or compositions I took, there was bound to be gold in these photos. That's when I heard something coming from inside the church. I wasn't sure I heard it at first, but the sound came again. It sounded like something scraping against the floor. I walked over to one of the church's windows and peered through. It was hard to see, given the lack of sunlight. All I could make out at first were some old pews, but then I noticed it. In the back corner of the church, near the dais, there was a suit of armor. I blinked my eyes at first, not really believing what I was seeing. But it was a suit of armor, all right, like something out of an old medieval film. I looked around to make sure nobody was nearby. The waitress had said I was not allowed inside the church, but this armor was too good of an opportunity to let up. There's something so absurdly gothic and mythic about this church. The armor was the icing on the cake. I tried the side door handle and was not surprised to find it locked. However, the door seemed old. I pushed my shoulder against it and found the old wood give a little. I tried a little harder and again could feel the door moving. Then, pulling all my weight into it, I busted through the door. I stepped into the old church. The pews were covered in dust and there was a rotten smell that was even stronger inside. In fact, it was downright repugnant, as if some animal had died in the church. I was startled when I heard a cawing sound and looked up to see a crow on one of the rafters. Above it was a medium-sized hole in the church's roof. It was in fact the largest crow I'd ever seen, almost intimidatingly so. I quickly took a couple of shots of the crow and it cocked its head to the side. It looked at me with those dark, beady eyes and gave another caw. I quickly turned away from the crow because as neat as it was secondary to what was at the end of the church. There was something so incredibly ugly about the crow. I'd never been a bird watcher, but had taken plenty of shots of some incredible-looking birds during my travels. But the crow just looked wrong, like some terrible child's drawing brought to life. As I approached the armor, I was aware of how even more amazing it was up close. This was not some hokey movie prop or cheap thing put together for some Renaissance fair. This was the real deal. Anyone could tell just looking at it. There was a unique spiralesque design ingrained throughout the entire chest and shoulder pieces. The armor was old-looking, sure, and there were hints of rust all across it, but there was something so regal about the armor. It stood proudly in the corner of the church, and it even held a sword between its hands. I brought up my camera and hungrily took my shots. 5, 10, 20, 30. I kept shooting. The armor was mesmerizing, even in the dull light of the church, which actually suited the mood just fine. These were going to be incredible photos. The crow cawed again, and I looked up at it for just a brief moment. What happened next, I will never forget for as long as I live. When I turned back towards the armor, it had moved closer to me. I stared at the armor in confusion, not fully comprehending what I was seeing at first, but I was sure of it. The armor was now closer to me. It was no longer standing in the corner of the church. Instead, it stood just at the edge of the platform that held the dais. The armor had moved. Is there someone in there? I asked nervously. But that was a stupid question. Even in the dim light, I could clearly see between the gaps in the armor, and there was no skin visible. There was no one in there. No one. Couldn't be. Until now, I'd assumed someone had put it together and left it standing in the corner of the church. I heard the sound of flapping wings and turned just in time to see the crow flying straight for me. I quickly ducked my head, and it passed me and landed on one of the pews. It cawed again, and I was aware now how much that cawing sound sounded like laughter. When I turned around, my heart almost stopped. The suit of armor was now standing directly in front of me. I fell back and landed in the center aisle of the church. "Who?" was all that I could say. Who's in there?" But again, I knew the answer. No one was in there. The armor was somehow moving on its own. Not taking my eyes off the armor, I slowly got up to my feet and understood one simple truth. I needed to get the hell out of the church. I turned around, but when I did, I heard the sound of metal and steel screeching. My instincts caused me to turn around. The suit of armor held its sword mere centimeters away from my face. It stood there as if frozen. That's when a thought dawned on me. A thought so absurd that I knew it could possibly break my sanity. Yet I also knew the thought was coming from truth. As insane as it was to believe, I knew that the armor was moving whenever I looked away, and somehow looking at the armor stops it in its tracks. Had I not turned back around, the sword would have cleaved me from behind. I took a step backwards, not taking my eyes off the armor. I took another step back, slowly making my way to the side door I'd entered from. Then I heard the cawing and felt a terrible sense of dread. The crow flew at me like a harbinger of death. It raked its talons across my face, and the pain was too much. I had to look away as I swatted at the dark bird. I knew it was a crucial mistake. I quickly rolled to the side just as I heard the sound of a sword swiping through the air. I only just managed to get away. When I looked up, the suit of armor stood frozen. Its sword was exactly where I had been standing a second ago. Again, it had almost cleaved me in two. I heard the crow caw again. It was flying up above the rafters, making its way back for another strike, like some old warplane coming back down for another flurry of attacks against a beach of soldiers. I held my hand up to my face and felt the blood dripping from my wounds. If I allowed the crow to attack me again, it would cause me to look away, and I might not be able to dodge the sword again. I backed away slowly and heard the crow coming down at me. Without taking my eyes off the suit of armor, I turned the flash on my camera and pointed it towards the sound of the crow and took a picture. There was a flashing light, and the crow made a painful cawing noise and flew over my head, just missing. I backed away more quickly now, not taking my eyes off the armor, which stood frozen. I wanted to move faster, but my legs moved like molasses. It was like those awful nightmares where no matter how hard you try to move, you simply can't, as if your feet are stuck in mud, and you know the terrible monster of your nightmare is coming for you. I heard the crow coming for another round, and again I pointed the camera in the direction of where it was coming and fired another shot. The crow, blinded again, completely missed me. Its cawing was furious now, not the sound of laughter, but of mad screeching. I could smell the air outside as my back reached the door exit. I was so close. Just a few more steps and I'd be out of the church. Closer, closer, closer. I stumbled. My foot hit something on the church floor, and I fell back and my eyes were taken off the suit of armor for a split second. I quickly looked up again, and the armor was standing right over me, its sword pointed straight down, the tip only inches away from plunging into my throat. I crawled back on my arms and legs, not taking my eyes off the armor. I felt the cool grass beneath me, and only when I was well and good out of the church did I stand up. I still didn't take my eyes off the armor, which was standing at the door exit, frozen, the sword still pointed down where I had been laying moments ago. I could hear the crow cawing madly somewhere inside the church. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the door exit, until eventually it was out of view and I was in the church's empty parking lot. I felt my car behind me and fell back against it, sobbing. I was still terrified to look away, even though I couldn't see the armor anymore. Even though deep inside I knew that I was out of harm's way, another part of me was certain that if I looked away, the armor would get me. Eventually, I mustered the courage and looked away. I turned and got into my car and drove. I left the town of Weatherford behind in my rearview mirror. I drove for hours, not stopping, still certain that the armor was following me. I drove like the devil was chasing me. Eventually, I made it to a motel. As I sat there on the bed of my cheap room, I knew I had to look at the pictures I had taken. But when I looked through my DSLR's photo history, there were no photos of the church, or the crow, or the terrible suit of armor. Instead, every photo I had taken that day were completely black. Nothing could be made out at all. Despite what amazing photos they would have made, I was grateful. I'm writing this now far away from the East Coast. I've made my way to the Midwest and have found myself nestled in a cozy cabin in the woods. Over the last couple of weeks, I had come to think that my time in the church had been some sort of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I had been pushing myself so hard, driving all across the coast. It had to have been some sort of fugue state. I had even come to start believing that lie. Until yesterday morning. Yesterday morning, as I was eating my breakfast, I heard the most terrible sound. I heard the sound of something cawing outside. The kind of cawing that sounds like laughter. Mad, terrifying laughter. I'm afraid to look because I'm sure that if I do, I'll see a peculiar suit of armor standing outside my cabin. The waitress was right. Some things are better off left alone, and some things follow you, no matter where you go.